One of my absolute favorite things about working with the Shengxiao Megaminx is just how much its mechanism can take. But today I wanted to really push that by making a cylindrical Megaminx and not using any extensions, or at least as few as I needed. The idea of this puzzle was brought about by the fact that I'm pretty much completely out of epoxy sculpt. I managed to find a small box of Milliput, which is the epoxy putty I used to use back when my channel first started, and it wasn't a whole lot, so I would have to ration it. So I figured if I tried doing a deep cut puzzle that didn't use many extensions, I wouldn't need that much epoxy sculpt to use, or Milliput in this case, and it would be a lot easier on me to build until I got more. The first step for this build, much like most puzzles, is to take all the center caps off so I have access to all of the screws. After I took all those center caps off, I tightened the puzzle down, not so far as to strip the core, but far enough that it wouldn't turn while I was cutting it on the bandsaw. After I'd finished tightening up all of the faces, I checked over the puzzle to make sure everything was properly tightened up before I took it over to my bandsaw. Now on the bandsaw I'm not doing anything particularly special here, I'm just trying to cut off any of the pieces that would prevent this puzzle from spinning freely on the belt sander. Remember, my goal here is to turn this puzzle into a cylinder, and to start off by rounding over some of the areas to make it easier to get that initial spin started is the first step in spinning the puzzle up. Don't just take it over to the belt sander and expect everything to go smoothly, it's usually a good idea to remove some material first. After I was finished cutting everything on the bandsaw, I took the puzzle over to my belt sander and I held the puzzle loosely between my fingers and I just started spinning it up against the belt to slowly sand away the plastic and also keep the puzzle spinning. I quickly realized that I hadn't tightened up some of the faces as much as I could have and they started to misalign, so I re-tightened up some of those faces and then I continued to sand the puzzle. I also made the quick change of swapping the 120 grit belt for an 80 grit belt, which was a little more aggressive and helped get the sanding done a little quicker. One of the important things to remember when sanding puzzles or pretty much anything in this way is you don't want to just let it freely spin with the travel of the belt. You want to provide some level of resistance so that something actually gets sanded away, otherwise it'll just spin for an hour and nothing will happen. The way I go about doing this is I hold the puzzle at a slight angle to the travel of the belt, which still allows it to naturally spin with the travel of the belt, but it provides enough resistance to slowly sand plastic and epoxy sculpt or whatever filler material it is that I'm using away as the puzzle spins. You don't want to just switch off and relax, you have to pay attention to it and start flipping things around every now and then to make sure that things don't sand unevenly, but this is the easiest way to go about making a cylinder, or at least I've found it's the easiest way that I can go about making a cylindrical puzzle. After I was finished sanding the puzzle, which I left about 2 or 3 millimeters away from its final dimension, this is what the puzzle looked like, and as you can see, it's almost perfectly cylindrical. There were some small problems with the shape, although I would fix those later on by filling all of the pieces and then scattering them throughout the puzzle to give it a more uniform shape. Now that the puzzle was all disassembled, it was time to break out that Milliput so that I could mix it up and start filling all of the pieces, and this is where my whole strategy for this build came crashing down. I cut off about 50% of the Milliput that I had and I started trying to mix it together. However, it was very quick for me to realize that it was not going to mix. Both sides were so stiff that I just couldn't get them to mix together properly, and after enough trial and error, they started to react in a very strange way, and it was clear to me that I just was not going to be able to use this stuff.
Well, there you have it, kids. Milliput has got a shelf life. Does it say on the box anywhere that it has a shelf life? No, but it does say it may cause skin allergies. That's just a double negative now, isn't it? Alright, well, fun's over. This stuff is definitely not playing ball. It's solidifying in some areas. Other areas are still kind of weird in consistency, and it's not mixing together properly. So it looks like, despite what is not written on the box, Milliput does have a shelf life, and well, this stuff is past its shelf life, but seeing as how there is such a tiny amount of it, I figure I might just be able to use my epoxy sculpt back there. I don't have a whole lot of it, but I have enough for what I need.
I mixed together a small amount of epoxy sculpt and I stuffed it into all of the pieces. And after I was done with that, I got a nail file out and I used it to round over some of the outside parts of the pieces, which would make it easier to put them back together. This was mainly for the centerpieces, which had a little epoxy sculpt on the outside that would have prevented movement, and so I had to sand that off. After I'd finished sanding some of the pieces, I reassembled the puzzle and then I took it back over to my belt sander to refine the cylindrical shape even more. The only thing I had left to do now was the extensions on the top and bottom of the puzzle, but I couldn't figure out exactly how long those needed to be until I had the puzzle at its final cylindrical shape. So I sanded it down pretty much until it was done, and after I was done with all the sanding, this is what it looked like. You can see the very small surfaces above and below where I'm going to have to extend the tiniest amount, but I still have to do it, so I took the puzzle back over to my desk and I disassembled it so I could start extending those pieces. While I was scuffing up some of the pieces and getting them ready for the extensions, I figured since I had the nail file here, I might as well round over the edges of all of the pieces, seeing as how I wouldn't really have to do a whole lot more sanding. I still had to take the puzzle back over to the belt sander, but that was only to sand down all of the extensions on the top and bottom of the puzzle. I wasn't going to be reducing the diameter of the cylinder anymore, and so I figured it wouldn't really hurt that much to sand all of these pieces up now. Along with rounding off all those pieces, I prepared the surfaces for the pieces that I was going to extend. All I had to do here was just scuff them up so that they would hold onto the epoxy sculpt before I started piling it on. I used a very small amount of epoxy sculpt and I slowly built up the shape of each of the extensions, and after they were cured, I just sanded them all down so that I could reassemble the puzzle. As you can tell, quite a lot of this build is repetitive sanding and more repetitive sanding. Although the sanding of these pieces is really just so that I can reassemble the puzzle, the majority of the external sanding will take place on the belt sander.
5 down. 25 to go.
After everything was reassembled and sanded, this is what the final shape of the puzzle looked like, and as you can see, those small extensions made all the difference. I really was tempted to just make this puzzle a little narrower and not have to do extensions, but I really think that it would have broken the puzzle if I did that, so I'm pretty happy with how this looks.
Alright, so now all of those pieces are sanded and I'm working on the extensions over there. I have a new issue, and that's this here. Now you can see this is the screw and spring setup for these centerpieces. Now, if I take the spring out and I just set the screw back in here, you can see that even in its lowest possible state, the screw kind of sticks out the top a little bit. Now that's a problem. What I want to do now is what I usually do in that situation, which is I want to turn the diameter of the screw head down so it can fit inside the hole here. That way I'll be able to sink this entire screw and spring assembly down underneath the surface, so I'll be able to cover it over with some epoxy sculpt.
I sifted through all the pieces to find all of the screws, and then I took them over to my belt sander to start reducing the diameter of the screw heads. This is actually a very easy step to do, although it's also very easy to overdo, so as I was chucking the pieces in my drill and slowly sanding them down, I had a centerpiece on hand to check and make sure that everything was lined up correctly. If I ended up making the screw head too small, it wouldn't hold onto the spring and I would have to get a new screw. There's really no way to fix that.
Okay, so that is the puzzle assembled, and it's looking pretty good now, actually. I've got the screws all sunk below the surface, which means that they don't ruin that beautiful cylindrical shape that I've gotten. And now what I have to do is I have to make sure that they're all at the correct tension that I'm happy with, and they also match the tensions of the top and the bottom, or at least feel like they do, because a shape-shifted puzzle doesn't always operate the same depending on which face has which tension. So I'll have to go through and I'll have to make sure that it all feels right and it also turns correctly, which it so far does, and I'm not too worried about the turning of this puzzle. And then I also have to cut out some very small circles of vinyl that I'm going to put over the screw caps, and then I'll be able to cover over all of that with epoxy sculpt so I can cover up all of these screw holes and make sure that you don't see any of that in the final result. Remember, this is all about aesthetics, so the holes matter. I like to use these little center caps because, well, the vinyl goes to waste otherwise, so I like to cut out a small circle and then use that. So that little piece of vinyl there is going to prevent the head of the screw from biting into the epoxy sculpt and then making the face turn with the screw. You don't want to do that. It can either very progressively tighten itself or worse, progressively loosen itself and then explode. I've had that happen to me more times than I'd like to admit. Heed my warning.
I went on to cut out the rest of the circles, and one by one I placed them on heads of each of the screws. And after that was done, all I had to do was stuff each of those holes with epoxy sculpt and then sand everything down to make it look like nothing ever happened. And here it is, the puzzle is reassembled and finally stick it up. Now I had two different sticker schemes in mind that I was tossing between while I was stickering this puzzle up. One was to have the traditional yellow opposite white on the top and bottom with all the other colors wrapping around the center, but I decided instead to go for the Megaminx color scheme, which had the white face with the 5 colors wrapping around it, and I still had orange, so I figured I'd just put that on the other end, and I think it looks pretty good overall. Now because this puzzle is cut down so deep, of course it does shapeshift, and it doesn't take a whole lot to start scrambling this puzzle up and having pieces stick out in all different directions. I can already tell that this puzzle is going to look absolutely chaotic scrambled up, and what better way to test that than to scramble it. I did say I was going to start scrambling my puzzles after building them from now on, and this is the first video where I actually get to do that. Now after filming all of this footage and scrambling this puzzle up, I did actually end up solving it, and it wasn't that hard. It was no different to a regular Megaminx solve, although that wasn't very intuitive to me at first. I was also pretty surprised to see just how hard it was to hold the puzzle and turn it while it was all shapeshifted like this. And so there you have it. This is the Megaminx cylinder, a puzzle that I should have built many years ago, but for some reason it took me until now to finally do it. There are so many of these seemingly simple modifications that I never got around to doing back in the day that I'm only just rediscovering and doing now. I guess you could say I'm on a roll. All joking aside though, this was actually a really fun project, and it was really great to just build a simple Megaminx modification that didn't have any big extensions or crazy fused bandage Siamese things going on. It was just a very simple modification that reminded me of a simpler time when all I had was a belt sander, a bandsaw, and some epoxy sculpt. I haven't really advanced much since then. So I guess that goes to show just how little you need to do all of this. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.